The very world we know took an unexpected turn this year. This year has awakened me, has awakened us all, has awakened us to truths we can no longer ignore. Women all over the world are hurting. Women all over the world need to be heard. So join me as I embark on a journey that will lead me into conversations with women all over the world on issues that women of this generation face on a global scale. Hi, Tala. How are you doing today?
Hey, Barbara. I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for taking the time to doing this with me and wanting to be a part of women around the world and highlighting Palestine in a time like this. So thank you again.
Yeah, of course. I'm really happy to be here. I know we've had several conversations before this, so it's really great to finally, get to do this.
Yes. Well, I'm excited because as soon as I reached out to a friend of mine that introduced us, I told him this is the kind of girl that I need for the show. And little did we both know that we have so much in common. We're literally like sisters from another mother in different countries. So I'm just happy that you're able to do this with me and that we can actually share friendship as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And shout out to Walid for connecting us. Um,
Yes.
we have been having this conversation for maybe a couple months now, so it feels really good to also connect with someone sort of across boundaries and across borders. Yeah, there's a lot that brings us together versus what divides us. Not to be too cliche.
So before we get into it, I want to ask just some fun cultural questions. You are originally Palestinian and Jordanian. Is that how you say it?
Yes, 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 yes.
Who reside in the UAE, United Nations Emirates. That is it correct?
United Arab Emirates, exactly.
Arab Emirates. Got that all wrong. But I want us to know a little bit about how it is to live in the UAE, and maybe some people can learn about the culture there through your eyes. So tell us, what is a favorite traditional dish?
All right. Uh, in the UAE or just like the region?
Just in general.
Well, from the UAE, so I've actually lived here for quite some time, and we can get into the details of that in a bit. Because I'm not originally from here, but the UAE is a very unique place because it's mostly expats. It's mostly people who come here for work from all over the world, and a lot of them stay here. A lot of them don't. My family is one of the ones that stuck around. And I think here in the UAE, there's like traditional Emirati dish that I love actually. Is called haris, which is almost like a bit of a like a yeah. It's like a savory porridge kind of thing. It's wheat um, cooked for a very long time with like meat or chicken, and so you end up with this like kind of like paste, and they kind of drizzle. I don't know, I feel like my mouth is watering right now. They drizzle like basically animal fat or ghee or something just like kind of on top. It's a bit of an acquired taste for I think people who come from outside, but I personally love it. It's really good.
Is
Yeah.
that more like a breakfast or lunch or dinner? Where
Great question. I don't want to say something because I'm not entirely sure, but it's usually used in like it's eaten regularly. It's definitely eaten during the month of Ramadan. It's pretty like soft on the stomach,
right?
easy to digest. So it's eaten pretty frequently, I would say.
Well, it sounds delicious. And so,
Yeah.
what is a popular hobby or fun activity to do there?
All right. So if you know the UAE or the Gulf in general, the Arabian Gulf, summers are really incredibly hot. Like
I hear.
very, very hot and very, very humid. So unfortunately, summers like we just stay indoors. That limits the outdoor possibilities. I think some of my favorite things to do here, um, honestly, exploring the food scene.
Mhm,
Because there are people from all over the world.
mhm,
You'll find like incredible restaurants that are super, super authentic. Where like one of my favorite restaurants in Dubai is this like Pakistani restaurant that a Pakistani friend of mine recommended. Everybody there is Pakistani. You go in, like you have to order the food like an hour before that. You go in, it's absolutely delicious. There's also like a Chinese hot pot place right next to it. Um, and so yeah, so I think that's one of the things that like maybe excite me the most, just like exploring that landscape.
and I'm a huge foodie, so all of that just sounds amazing to me. And what is your favorite city in the UAE and why?
Hmm. That's a tough question. I lived in Dubai growing up.
Okay.
So the UAE is sort of, it's kind of similar to the US because it's different. It's almost different states. It's different emirates. So it's a federal union of sorts. And right now I'm in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, which is the capital. But there's also Dubai. There's five others. So in total there's seven. I really appreciate Dubai. I lived there for a while. I love going there every other weekend, but I think I prefer Abu Dhabi. It's a bit more laid back. It's chill. It feels more homey. My family just moved here also from Dubai, so now it feels more, even more comfortable and more homey. So I would say Abu Dhabi city.
Dubai.
Yeah,
Dubai's kind of more of like a city feel versus I'm pretty sure
yeah.
everywhere else, right? That's the
Oh my
main.
God, yeah.
That's
It's
the.
an amazing city.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's
Yeah,
beautiful. And
yeah.
what is your favorite part about being a Palestinian, Jordanian woman, and why?
Oh my God. um, all right. How do we unpack that question? Um, my favorite part of being that, look, to be honest, like I'm not someone who, like I do think of like human values that kind of that we have in common before, our nationality or this defining factor or that defining factor. I think that being Palestinian has sort of instilled a sense of justice in me, and like that value is a very important one to me. Um, and it's the reason I keep up with I have always kept up with like different movements and changes happening around the world. It has probably influenced it has bought like I think that was the biggest influence on why I ended up going into international affairs and culture and politics and sort of studying that, because I like understanding cultures and frameworks and societies and politics and all of that good stuff. So I think that is something I'm both grateful for, but I also think that it just, because I am that way, it opens my eyes to a lot of things that could also at the same time cause me a lot of like, you know, disappointment or honestly sadness for a lot of the things that are happening around the world right now, and a lot of different groups that are completely disenfranchised because of their skin color or their ethnicity or this or that. So it's kind of like mixed feelings. I think we do need that in the world, and I'm always super happy to connect with people like you and who care about that. And I think our generation now is a bit different from the previous generation in the sense that we kind of, because we're so globalized and we kind of have
There.
a lot in
Hmm.
common. Yeah, exactly. So like I might have more in common with you than someone of my same ethnicity who has lived somewhere else. So I always find that very fascinating. That's a very long answer to your question, and I don't even know if it's an answer. So
Beautiful. Again, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show is because when I started Women Around the World, I had this whole other concept going on with my talk show that I was doing, and I was just bringing on girls that are entrepreneurs or CEOs or doing or being their own boss in some way and can be of inspiration to other women. But with the pandemic and everything that has just been coming up, they say this year is the year of enlightenment because so many things are just like coming up from places where we didn't even know these things were going on. And even though they have been going on, a lot of people are being awoken to the reality of the worlds that we live in.
Yeah.
And during during my planning of Women Around the World, I started learning a lot about the Israeli Palestinian conflict situation, whatever you want to call it. And I was just so sad. And not because I'm not the type of person to pick a side and be like, this is how it should be, even though yes, I am that way and will hide my beliefs in what in some way, shape, or form. But when it comes to this, I really wanted to bring somebody on from Palestine that can just talk about what's going on, because it doesn't matter what people believe in, doesn't matter what your religious beliefs are or what side of politics you stand on. What's going on to the people of Palestine is, it's, as a human, it's sad. As a human being, you should be sad. And that's where I stand with this. And this is why I wanted to talk about it, because this is no longer about, you know, what you believe in, what you think is right. This is about what's happening to innocent lives, to children and families. And
Yeah.
so that breaks my heart. It breaks my heart that people turn their eye to that, turn their, you know, blind side to that and don't show care or worry for what's going on. And so I really wanted to bring you on. I think a lot of people are scared to talk about this because of fear of conflict, but I am not the person to be fearful of anything. I will bring things to light the way that they should be, and then everybody else can just do whatever they want at the end. But
Yeah.
thank you again.
Barbara, honestly, and I remember our first conversation just about this. You know, I remember, like, you know, my friend told me about you, and then we connected, and I was like, okay, I wonder how this conversation with this girl from who lives in Florida is gonna be like. And I think that you know, bringing light to some of these issues is so important, because it just might help people know how to think about things when they do come up. It's not necessarily, like, personally speaking, I'm not interested in telling people what to think, or push anyone in like this direction or that direction. It's just if we can agree on like the basics
Right.
of humanity and human values and human rights, it does usually result in that feeling that you described as sadness. As for some people, it's anger, frustration, helplessness. It's very depressing. What I'll say, like, before we get into this, what I will acknowledge is this is a very contentious topic because there are a lot of not just voices, but a lot of powerful voices involved, from both sides. Um, and when I say, actually, it's not really both sides, because that implies that there are two. And I think if you dig and look deeper, there's actually a lot more. And there's a lot of other forces that kind of, you know, work, and not in a, you know, secretive or covert way, although that does obviously happen. But you know, this is not like, most of these things are not secrets. And the other thing I want to begin with is, being Palestinian is, it can mean many different things. I am Palestinian. I do identify as Palestinian. It's something that I'm very proud of, so to speak. Not because I'm nationalistic. I actually think that if Palestine, I actually often say this, if Palestine was not occupied, I probably would not be talking about it ever.
Yeah.
But from a humanitarian perspective, it's something that interests me. It's something that has impacted my family on a direct level. But also, I don't have a Palestinian passport, which doesn't really exist. It's not really a passport. It's like a Palestinian Authority passport. So that's another interesting thing that some people who are not Palestinian may not know. I don't have the Palestinian documents that allow me to go into Palestine. I've never been to Palestine, or any of its cities. I've never been to my original hometown in Western Jerusalem, which is now a settlement called Nes Harim. It's like an agricultural settlement. So I think that I'm never ever a fan of when people say, well, as a woman, this is what I think. because I don't think anyone has the right to say, to like represent such a massive population. And so I will not say like, as a Palestinian, this is how it is and this is how it is. So I represent myself. I represent maybe some people who watch this may relate. Maybe some Palestinian women who watch this might relate. Maybe some people might not. Um, and the reason I acknowledge this is because there are Palestinian women inside Palestine and inside Israel and in Gaza who have a very different lived experience that I can study for years. And yes, sure, I might know it intellectually, but I will never actually experience myself, and I never have. And so I do want to acknowledge that because I do think it's important. I'm a Palestinian in diaspora. Palestinian diaspora is it's a massive, massive population. It's a running joke in our communities that like wherever you go, you will find a Palestinian. And this was actually true because I was, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this. I was in Texas for a year in high school. I was on a cultural exchange program, and I was in a very small town. And just like 15 minutes outside of that town, there was like a pizzeria owned by like a Palestinian family. I found out like at the end of my stay. And I was just like, I can't believe this. Cause like, of course, there's a Palestinian family living there. So we're everywhere.
Yeah.
Latin America, all over really. Yeah, and I may also not represent, you know, the experience of Palestinian women in diaspora even. I represent maybe some Palestinian women who have lived in the UAE or the Gulf or something like that. And even then, like, it's also very different. That is like a maybe, you know, it's not about like representation in that side and in that way, but you know, for me that doesn't take away also from my identity. It doesn't take away from the fact that I am Palestinian. It doesn't take away from the fact that this has impacted me, whether it's through studying it or whether through experiencing it or whether through, you know, the impact of being displaced and exiled and all of the implications over decades that had on my immediate family, which is a very real thing that people may not talk about very often. You know, it's one thing to be a refugee, and it's another to kind of settle in a different country or be a refugee and then settle, which is what happened to my family. My dad's family, they were, you know, they lived in a refugee camp and then they settled in that country, which is Jordan. And then, you know, I kind of, home for me is not, I don't know where home is for me. It's sort of like, it's where my immediate family is, but that's about it. It's not a place. And in that way, maybe, you know, that's something that maybe a lot of people can relate to, especially now because we're very, very
Right.
globalized.
Exactly. And I really want to get into basically talking about your story. Where did your family come from? How tell us a little about your father's story and kind of like how what he went through.
Yeah, so this is like so if you're familiar with like a timeline, I'm not going to get into like a lot of the history of it, but as I said, my dad's family is originally from a small town in Western Jerusalem. And in 1948, this was the year that we refer to as the Nakba, which translates to catastrophe. And the reason we refer to it that way is because of the catastrophe that happened to the Palestinian people at the time, um, being forced to leave their homes, taking their keys with them because they thought that they would be able to return. And that's why the key is a symbol for the right of return for Palestinians. And any Palestinian you talk to will probably be familiar with this. So in 1948, my grandpa and his mom and his sister lived in it was an agricultural town. His dad had passed away. And in 1948, they had to leave that town because the Jewish militias were coming. And that's when there was another massacre in a town very nearby. And these are documented tactics to kind of push people out of their homes. At the time, this is all very much documented. And I'm happy to share some sources with you. And they moved to a refugee camp in Bethlehem. And after that, obviously it's a life of kind of movement and whatnot. Eventually, they settled in Jericho, where my dad was born in 1967. And 2 months after my dad was born in 1967, the second version of the Nakba, which is the catastrophe, happened with what is referred to as the 6 Day War, the Arab-Israeli War, whatever you want to call it, which is it's a very different narrative for each side. But after that, my dad's family, he was 2 months old, so he didn't remember any of it, but they were pushed into Jordan. They had to leave and they had to go to Jordan. And in Jordan, they were in a refugee camp, excuse me. And in that refugee camp, my dad lived there. There, it was obviously a very difficult life. They actually lived in houses that had they were lined with asbestos, which is now a substance that we now know causes cancer and all of that. And so refugees were exposed to a lot of that. There were UN organizations that were taking care of the refugees or providing basic services and resources, but it was generally tough, obviously. The area that my dad was in still exists today. It's just instead of tents, it's now houses. But it's almost like slums, honestly. It's it's not in good shape. It's just kind of bricks over each other, and you'll see massive hills just packed with these really shabby homes or huts or whatever you want to call them. And it's quite a sight. If you go to Jordan, Eastern Amman, which is the capital, the eastern side of it, you'll see a lot of that. And so, yeah, so my dad had to work really, really hard to get out of that, because obviously he didn't have access to a lot of resources. They didn't have anything. They left everything behind. And so he had to work really hard. He obviously didn't speak great English. He ended up going to university and whatnot, and he ended up coming to the UAE for better opportunities. And even here, there's something about there's something that people don't acknowledge, maybe outside of this region, or don't realize or understand the implications or the impact of colonialism in this part of the world. This part of the world was colonized for a very long time. And colonialism, as you may know, brings with it not just, power system, it brings with it power structures. And the power structures that were brought here happen to obviously, prefer white people or fair skin or whatever, or people who spoke English even. If you spoke English, you had access to some privileges. If you had a specific passport, you had access to some privileges. If you looked a certain way, you had access to some privileges. And we see those systems, everywhere in the world. India has their own version of that. And obviously in the States now with Black Lives Matter, the movement and everything happening, a lot of that is going under the microscope. Thank God. And basically, yeah, so he came here. He had to work here. Obviously, he didn't have access to a lot of privileges. He had to, work extra hard. And he managed to give us a life that, looking back, I'm so grateful for all the work that he did. And really, he truly did almost the impossible. But the problem is these things obviously come at a price, at a cost, and that cost was his health. And so my dad was constantly under stress and pressure, and really wanted to make ends meet, and wanted to make sure that we had everything that we needed, etc. And he didn't have a safety net. He didn't have a backing. He didn't have any of that. He was technically he was still technically he has a passport. It's a Jordanian passport, but the lived experience and what he went through, and the kind of how he went through life, he was a refugee, and his family was too. And so my dad, because of that, and because of all the stress and all of that, he unfortunately was diagnosed with cancer. And unfortunately, when we found out about it, it was too late. It was a very, very late stage. And this was 3 years ago. And 2 months after we found out, he passed away. And obviously, it was a devastating time. It was very, it's a very difficult thing as it is. My dad was extremely young and he looked very young. So like he had like no white hair. He had and he was 49 when he was diagnosed. He turned 50 a month later, and then a month later he passed away. So it was very sad. It's also always really heartbreaking when someone, like someone hasn't lived their full life. And it's hard for me to say this because he's my father, and it always kind of, it's, I don't want to admit that, Um, and yes, of course, like there's grief and there's all of that, but also there's this like sense of, if this hadn't happened and if my dad was not and his family were not put in these situations, he wouldn't have had to work so hard. He wouldn't have had, to feel so stressed all the time. He wouldn't have had to, experience all of those difficulties and all of those obstacles that, people of color in the US have to go through. There's a reason there are specific groups that have, certain health conditions different from other groups. And so at the end of the day, who we are is connected to our bodies, and our bodies are sensitive to these things. So all of these things do get manifested. And, there's that sense and there's that feeling inside me that like, well, if this wasn't the case, maybe this wouldn't have happened. And that feeling I have is something that is not easy to measure. It's not easy to capture that in the Palestinian experience. It's not easy to put that in a museum. It's not easy to write a book about that. Maybe it is, maybe I don't know, maybe I need to figure it out. It's different when you talk about numbers and people are concerned about acres of land and the number of X and the number of Y and the years and the history and whatnot, but we forget that there is a human experience here. This is something that I think Palestinians outside of Palestine have experienced. People inside Palestine and Israel experience also, but maybe in different ways.
And so I want to ask how, and not to cut you off, but I really want to know, how has that, like seeing what your father went through and his experience, how has that impacted you as a woman, as a Palestinian woman? Do you think that the way it's impacted you is a similar experience for maybe somebody else that has gone through something like that or has had parents that derive from Palestine?
Yeah, I think that for sure my dad had and my mom, both of them had always had a connection to Palestine and the cause. And for Palestinians, it's like we have the culture of not forgetting, that we will never forget. We will always, always hold Palestine as the homeland, and we will always want to return. And it's ultimately, because it's a feeling of being uprooted, and it's that feeling is not something that a lot of people understand if they didn't go through it.
Right.
Them focusing on this from a young age, I always had that kind of like in the back of my mind. I was always very curious. I always felt connected. I always, visually saw like the maps and the keys and the emblems and the symbols and all of those things. And I always heard the stories. So I was always, I took a lot from my dad and I took a lot from my mom. And being a Palestinian woman is like, for me, was like, being someone who will not forget about Palestine, but will also work incredibly hard to kind of be a voice, whether, I didn't think that I would go into like, culture and politics and study all of that. And I didn't want to go into the actual field of politics. But to this day, like, it's just something that I will always have in the back of my mind. And wherever I go, I would like to contribute in one way or another, whether it's through education or creating opportunities or data or tech or whatever it is, for that, and represent the Palestinian experience in the best way that I can.
Mhm. And I think and this is the way that I see it, I think a lot of people tend to forget when they think about Palestine and think about Israel, they think that they see it as like this outside, I don't even know how to describe it, but people tend to forget that there are people that live in Palestine, and the people that come from Palestine, they're not living there to as a political statement. They're not living there or lived there as a political statement. And I think people forget that they're actual human beings and children that have grown up to see their mother and father giving them a home and giving them all these things, but then they didn't want any of this. They didn't expect a war to come from where they live. I don't think a lot of people grow up where they do or in their hometowns and think that their existence is a political thing. And
Yeah.
so I really wanted to ask about your father's experience and obviously give a little background of his human life and what he went through, and then just dive into how that's affected you as a daughter and you as a human, and what what are you going to do with all of that moving forward. And even before we get into that, I think we should talk about kind of like maybe the facts of what's going on, so people can actually know. For those that don't know, a lot of people don't know the actual facts. They know that there's an issue and there's a war and nobody really cares to look into it because it seems complicated, but it's really not that complicated once you do bring it down.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you use the word existence, because when you have forces, very powerful forces, working deliberately to erase your existence and your identity, existence is resistance. And that's how it's seen in a lot of Palestinian communities. So just merely saying, I am Palestinian, you are kind of doing like, it's almost like a moral duty. That's how I've always seen it. It's like, I'm here, this exists, this is something, and no matter how many millions and billions of dollars that you pour in to erase that, I am here and I exist, and
Or are we
that is my, yeah, it's like it is a form of resistance. And there's actually another really interesting phenomenon with Palestinians and Palestinian families. They'll call their kids like names of cities in Palestine, or names that relate to the Palestinian cause as a whole. And so I think that in terms of you know how you described it is like, to some people it's a lot. And to be honest with you, Barbara, like I understand that. Like I do understand that. I think it is a lot. I think it is confusing, and I think it is scary. And it's, you don't want to offend. And if you don't know much, like you don't want to ask the wrong questions. And when you do want to ask a question, you don't want to seem ignorant. And to be honest, there's so much information out there that, like, I honestly, if I wasn't Palestinian, or if I wasn't this, or even if I was Palestinian, like I wouldn't know where to start necessarily.
Mhm.
So I think I have a sense of like empathy for people who, want to learn and get to know the situation. I know that it's not my job necessarily to explain, and that's not something that, that should be the responsibility of Palestinians too. But I do think that, we can practice empathy and compassion in that way, where if someone is kind of curious, it's okay to kind of like show them the way and give them like just kind of, light the way for them, because it usually does come from a good place. Um, what you've described, I do think that, like, if you boil it down, there are facts that really speak for themselves. I think that there are main reasons why, in my opinion, this is a kind of, this is hard to navigate. Um, so before, as I said, like I am Palestinian, and I ended up studying a lot of this stuff. Not initially, honestly, a lot of it happened by chance. I do want to start with that, because a lot of what I'm going to say now is actually not a result of my experience as a Palestinian, but as a result of my experience as a scholar, as a, as these are the things that I kind of researched. And yeah. And I think that there are a couple of things that people need to kind of recognize and understand as they navigate this. I'm not going to obviously go over all of the information, but I think some of the most important things, and I will pull up a couple of things that I have noted here. Um, so there's a topic that a lot of people don't know about. First of all, it's this is something that a lot of people in this region and also in the States outside these circles don't know about, and that is Christian Zionism. And Zionism, you may be familiar, is a political movement that supports the creation of the state of Israel, blah blah blah. And it's obviously it's a political movement that has a lot of that has been mobilizing and has been fundraising and has been doing a lot of things to support the state of Israel for a very long time. There's a very powerful Israeli lobby in the US, and all of that. But I think what a lot of people don't recognize, ironically, in this part of the world, and I do think it's important, is the role of Christian Zionism, which is, in a nutshell, Christian Zionism is the support for the creation of the state of Israel and the support for the state of Israel. But the difference is that it's rooted in fundamental Christian belief. And when I say fundamental, I mean, it's a literalist approach to the Bible, and it's just like literally interpreting some of the things in the Bible. And I won't bore you with the details, but it was a very interesting topic that opened my eyes to a lot of things that didn't make sense to me before that. As I said, I was in Texas, in a very small town, and the population there probably, never ever met anyone who's like Palestinian, Arab. Sorry?
Which is why your English is amazing.
I actually, funny enough, it's my English is a result of cultural imperialism. Like, if I'm being very honest right now, my first language is Arabic, and alhamdulillah, like my family has done a very good job making sure that we, keep the Arabic. But also the English was a result of just watching a lot of movies and reading a lot of books. In practical terms, Christian Zionism, I think, especially for, Barbara, maybe like a lot of, your friends and the people who are watching this are probably in the US. So I think intellectually speaking, or like the actual definition of Christian Zionism may not be as relevant as, what it is in practical terms. And what it is basically just like this movement and this belief that, it's almost like a religious duty to support the state of Israel. And the Christian Zionist lobby is huge. They export millions of dollars every year to support Israel blindly. And it's really ironic because the idea is that they support the creation of the state of Israel because to basically facilitate the second coming of Jesus. And so ultimately it's like supporting someone because you want something out of what they're doing. And so it's a bit problematic even for Jewish people in the US and abroad, especially those who are pro-Palestinian. There's a lot of them, which is amazing. And, I think now more than ever, and I don't want to get sidetracked, but now more than ever, this is the time to build like alliances and to have allies for causes of this kind. Because realistically speaking, like, and I always say this, as a Palestinian, my voice may not be heard even. I think that the biggest hope I have is with Jewish millennials, and Jewish Gen Zers now who are getting exposed to this, and like, they're learning more, and they can become, active allies of this, because what, unites, if we put aside all of the BS really, it's really, it really does come down to a humanitarian crisis, legally and in every other way. Now, the most important things, in my opinion, for someone who doesn't know much about this topic, to recognize is that, like, the way we think about, like, today, right now, we're in countries, right? We have a country, you live in a country, I live in a country that has a flag, it has a national anthem, it has institutions, it has a constitution, it has all of these things, and that is not how things always were. This is an example right now, like, this is an example of the nation state, and it wasn't always like that. We didn't have nations in the same way that we do now. So when when people think about Palestine and Israel, some of the, one of the arguments that you hear very often is, well, this wasn't a country before. Well, actually, at the time, most countries were not countries. So this is something that people need
Started
to,
off being a country on its own.
yeah, is most people don't understand that. And going back to colonialism, this part of the world was colonized by the British Empire, and at the time it was not called the United Kingdom, it was called the British Empire. And so it was a lot of empires. There was the Ottoman Empire, and there was all of that. And so Palestine, as we refer to it today, was not a country in the same way like Zambia is a country right now. It was a British mandate. And at the time, that is how it was. So if you look back, in the 1900s, there was about 70 countries. And then from the 1940s and going up, that's the rise of the nation state. And over the course of maybe a couple of decades, it just really spiked. There was a movement that swept not just this part of the world, but Africa as well. Like, I think within like a 10-year span, and I hope I'm getting this right, I think there was like 25 new countries that were declared in Africa alone. There was also the countries in Eastern Europe that started declaring independence, especially after the 1990s, and started basically taking their shape as a nation state as we know it today. So I think one thing that people struggle with is, like, they think that this is how everything was forever.
Yeah.
And it wasn't. The other thing is, um, I just think that this point in particular is very, very critical. And I think that if you look back, the other really interesting thing is this relationship between the US and Israel. It's fascinating. It's truly fascinating. If you look into it, and there are a few things that there's a really excellent documentary called TV's Promised Land, that I think you and I talked about briefly. I know that you may want to show something, like a video or something from, but basically the idea at the time was that Palestine was a land with no people. Well, now how it's sorry, not the idea at the time. Now how a lot of people think about it is that there was no one there, and this is a myth. This is actually just another fabrication,
Right.
because there were people there. So if I take a step back, studying culture and politics and studying and like understanding American history has helped me understand a lot more about Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, although I think of it, I refer to it as an occupation because it's not proportional. So if I ended up studying American studies of all things, which sounds so random. And even like, my family was very confused probably when I told them. And it was, honestly, it basically, I studied like the history and the structures on which American society was built. And to me, that was fascinating. I wanted to understand it. But the choice was not like, this like super inspiring reason why I wanted to. It honestly just happened by chance. There was a professor I really, really liked. And she happened to be a US history professor. And she taught a bunch of classes about US not history in like the boring sense where we learned it in school. I actually discovered I'm a massive history buff in college. I loved history. And it's so important to understand it because it's like the way you think about things, and it's not necessarily about the dates and the, this event happened there.
Better understanding of everything, really, like where it comes from, how we're here, how we
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that absolutely it helped me understand a lot is that first of all, nothing is linear. In history, in history, like it's never linear. There's no like start and this event happened, then this event happened, then this event happened. And it also taught me that, history as we know it right now is a product of power, and you can't really understand history without understanding power. And so I ended up taking a bunch of courses with her, from like film history to, a bunch of stuff about like, I think there was like one seminar I took on that's on theology. And there was a lot of like just US history and US foreign policy. And I ended up taking so many of her courses that basically I ended up with a minor. Anyway, so one of the topics that I learned about in my study with her was Christian Zionism. So basically, I didn't have the language up until that moment. I didn't have the language to describe or even understand some of the things that I saw when I lived in Texas around Christian Zionism. I volunteered at a church every Wednesday, and served food and got to know the community, and everyone was super warm and wonderful, really, even though I was very different from them. But I also saw a lot of things that kind of made me like very curious. And these things I didn't really understand or have the language to describe them or understand them until I really studied that. And then things started kind of like falling in place, and I was like, oh, so this is why this happened, and this is why that teacher said this to me, and this is blah blah blah. And I think that understanding US history helped me understand a lot as a Palestinian, because there is such a parallel. Israel used very, very, very similar tactics or techniques in the narrative and the rhetoric that was extremely similar to the rhetoric in American history and expansion, especially like expansionist, basically agenda. And so if you look back to like Manifest Destiny, it's something that in America, like you learn about, and it's westward expansion, and this is our, our God-given right, and this is our duty, and this is, we're going to go and plant the desert, and this like empty land we are going to build and produce, and this like capitalist sort of like dream come true. Basically, the rhetoric that was used in the United States and the rhetoric that's used in Israel currently and has been used there are very similar in terms of justifying expansion and justifying the occupation of lands that actually belong to indigenous populations. In Israel, these are the Palestinians who have lived there for a very, very long time. There has always been a culture there. There were always people there. It was a very vibrant collection of cities and communities, agricultural and otherwise commercial. And it really, there was a life there. It wasn't like a land with no people. But when you look at the historical context, and you see the situation that Jewish communities in Europe were under, and how that narrative was formed. People also, you want to kind of give refuge to these people seeking safety. Ironically speaking, in the 1940s and 1948, Jewish people who tried to escape Europe and go to the US were actually rejected and sent back. So this is something that a lot of people don't know. And so that's why I think it's very difficult. But I think that one of the mistakes that people go in is trying to diminish the struggles and the trauma that one of the sides has had. And I don't think that's helpful. I don't think that's healthy. But at the end of the day, it shouldn't be like one people at the expense of another, the existence of one people at the expense of another. And that is unfortunately what has happened to Palestinian people. They are paying the price right now. They have been for the past 70, 80, 90 years. And it's really brutal. Communities in Palestine are incredibly disenfranchised. There's no access to opportunities. There's no access to jobs. A lot of them, the only possible source of income is actually working as laborers to build illegal settlements.
Wow.
That's the only option that they have. So imagine like the conflict, the internal conflict, and the kind of emotional weight of things like that on a person, and how that can impact their lives. There's also, a very simple, like there's restriction of movement. A trip that should take 15 minutes can take up to 9 hours because of checkpoints that are put in place. There have been a lot of parallels drawn between Israel and apartheid South Africa, because there's a very clear distinction on the kind of privileges that you have access to as a Palestinian versus the ones that you would have access to as a Jew or a Westerner. So all of these things are things that people really need to understand. And I don't think anything justifies this, just objectively speaking. And I think one of the main things is that for Americans, I think that Americans and people like you, Barbara, are in a position where they can influence this change, because America is the biggest supporter of Israel and has been funding it with millions and millions and billions of dollars over the years. And all of this is actually going from taxpayer money, but influencing this by, communicating with your representatives and whatnot is so important right now more than ever. And there's really no shortage of people who are working around the clock to make sure that all of these injustices are documented, and the parties that are responsible for them are eventually held accountable. It's just that power right now is not with Palestinians. Palestinians do not have power. The voices of Palestinians are truly, truly silenced in so many ways, and they're really fighting a massive tsunami of a current, and a lot of power and a lot of money. And so now more than ever, we do need like intersectional alliances. We do need people to really get educated, and to really recognize that there were, Palestinians existed there. My family existed there before 1948 and were exiled. And I know that you want to share something
There's
about that.
there was a whole people, a culture, and I've seen videos where my heart just breaks, because I don't think anybody can imagine their countries, their entire cultures being completely washed away. And so I want to show a video just to kind of put in people's minds the reality of what's really going on. And so we'll be right back. So as you can all see, what's happening is in Palestine is not, it's not a political thing. It's not a belief thing. It's a humanity thing. And if you're a human being that has a heart, what you saw and what you're seeing happening is not something that we should be endorsing or supporting or wanting these things to happen to humans, to a country, to people. And so I just want to thank you again for obviously taking the time to open up about what's really going on. I am beyond grateful that you could have taken the opportunity. You're doing so much. You're literally the most busiest person, more busy than me, the busiest person that I know. And you took the time to do this. And because this show is about women, I want to ask you, do you see a direct impact towards Palestinian women, towards you, your mother, your grandmother, women that you know?
That's an excellent question, Barbara. Of course, unfortunately, and we see this everywhere around the world, it's always unfortunately been like that, because women are already in vulnerable positions in society. When things like occupation happen, you know that that's going to impact women disproportionately. And actually, Palestinian communities right now, because of the lack of access to education, to travel, to movement, all of this, kind of like isolation, really, over the past almost century, really. It has led to a lot of social problems. And of course, women get impacted, again, disproportionately. And so, in terms of women kind of fulfilling their potential, being an active part of the workforce and whatnot, Palestinian women are known for their resilience. They always have been, but unfortunately now in some of those sub-communities, there you see a lot of discrimination, you see some like honor killings, you see some really regressive ideas about what women should do, what women should wear, what women should be, and there's, obviously violence against women, even within the Palestinian communities, and this is something as a Palestinian woman I can talk about, but it's also, how do you overcome things like that? It's with access to education and access to services and access to protection. And Palestinians are ripped, these things and all of these privileges have been ripped away, and they're not allowed to really have access to these things. And so it is always a result of not the culture. Arabs and Muslims or Christians, also another thing that a lot of people don't recognize is that there's a massive Christian Palestinian population. It's not just Muslims. And there's also atheists, Palestinians, there's agnostic, there's also all kinds of, we come in all shapes and colors. But really, none of these things that we see today and these social problems, we can't attribute them to, the DNA in the same way that, and it's always about power, right? So like in the States, you see certain stereotypes being attached or affiliated with certain minorities. And this is about power. It's not that this minority inherently does 1, 2, and 3, but it's that the conditions in which this community was brought up, what it's allowed to have access to, eventually results in those things, and the obstacles that are put in their way. So unfortunately, it does impact women a lot. It's terrible, it's heartbreaking for everybody, women and men alike. But of course, there are the gendered struggles as well, on top of everything else that comes with occupation, on top of the trauma, on top of the incredibly high suicide rates, on top of the, it's really grim. And there is no way we can get through all of it. There is so much more, and there's so much to talk about, and there's so much to cover. But I hope that I've shared just like a little bit of what's important, at least from my side. And again, like there are incredible women and men out there who are much more knowledgeable than I am, who really work incredibly hard to tell that story. And these people are Palestinian, and a lot of them are not Palestinian, and a lot of them are Jewish also. So we do have Jewish allies as well. And that's what we need, because this is a human issue. It is a human issue. It's been painted as political and religious and whatnot. And of course, these things are part of it. They're not, it's not that at all. But at its very core, it is a human issue. And I'm hopeful. I'm a bit naive in that sense, maybe, but I'm hopeful that one day we can get past this like nationalistic fervor, and just just focus on human rights. And at the end of the day, for me personally, I would not want anyone to be uprooted. I would not want anyone to feel marginalized, regardless of their ethnic background.
Well, thank you again. You are beyond well versed in this whole concept and idea. I've learned so much from you just from listening to you. I can sit there and do all my research and try to understand really what's been going on. It's complicated in a sense, but when you hear it from somebody that is Palestinian and has had experience and knows the truth and know what's really going on, it's a whole different experience. So thank you again. What do you think people can do now as far as making a change or bringing awareness at least to what's going on?
Well, that's a great question. I think there are two things that immediately come to mind. Obviously, the first is social media and the power of social media right now. The really interesting thing is that every struggle and every cause really has its unique context. But what you'll find across the spectrum is that there are a lot of parallels that you can draw between the causes that especially minorities or disenfranchised communities go through, whether, and you can very easily draw that comparison between, let's say, like Palestinians and Native Americans, or even some of the struggles that African Americans have experienced in the United States. Of course, the history is different and whatnot, but in terms of the themes and the tropes and the kind of that struggle against power and oppression, they're very similar. And so now more than ever, I would truly hope that anybody who cares about any of these causes really sees the parallels and sees the overlap between them and highlights them. And if you are American, I can tell you right now that you probably have a lot more privilege than a lot of other people. And your voice is heard just because of that power. And so using your voice for these causes is so valuable. You might think that, you might not make a lot of difference, but you can actually impact a lot of change. And so there are a lot of accounts on social media that cover really important information. It's really important to stay up to date with the information and to really become aware and understand what the conflict is about, and to really think critically about media and all of these biases. The second thing is, and I know this is a very tense time for people in the US with the elections coming up.
Just a
It's
little
crazy.
bit. Just a little
Yes.
bit. Just a little bit.
Yeah, it's crazy. And unfortunately, like it's where, it can go really bad. And for Palestinians, the past 4 years have been possibly the worst 4 years in a very, very, very long time, just because of,
For a lot of
we
people.
took so many steps backwards, and there's no going back from that. When you give up, when you decide to move the embassy to Jerusalem, this is a massive political statement, and there's no, Palestinians unfortunately don't have power to really do anything about that in the face of Israel and the US. So pressuring the people who can make a change, honestly, putting pressure on them. I think it's one of the things that, it's one of the channels that people can tap into. And just trying to just honestly be a voice of reason and dialogue wherever. This is in no way, I'm not a big fan of, like, it's never black and white. And even when we talk about the truth, what is the truth? The truth is like layers and layers and layers of, narratives and stories and people coming together. And at the end of the day, if it's something that demonizes the other side, chances are it's not the truth. But like just thinking critically about these things, but not in a way that now more than ever we need people to build bridges and not destroy them and burn them. It's a very hyper polarized world. I personally don't think that will get us anywhere. Your social media algorithms will only show you the people who you would agree with. Absolutely, which is so dangerous. It's so dangerous. We have to be able to have conversations with people who
Yes.
don't agree with us or we disagree with without it turning into a massive, war or fight or battle. And so just like also trying to understand where the other person or other side is coming from. I will always say that I just don't, and at the end of the day, one thing I'll end on is when we talk about peace, one of the most beautiful things from the Black Lives Matter movement is, no justice, no peace, which is something ironically I've been saying for years about Palestine, because people say, like, we want peace, we want peace. And peace, when you have such an unproportional balance of power, peace just means that it's convenient for the powerful that the less powerful are silent. It's peace, it's silence. But actually, what you need is justice. What you need is equity, and that might disrupt the peace. But we should be okay with the peace being disrupted for a while
Right.
until justice is served. So that's how I see it, and it's really refreshing to see that people are starting to see things through that lens. And I hope that they can apply this lens everywhere, not just when it comes to Palestine, when it comes to all of these other humanitarian issues happening around the world, and just like impacting change, where we can.
I love that. And thank you again. This was amazing,
Yeah.
beyond amazing. So thank you. And I hope to be in Abu Dhabi soon to just give you a big hug and we can just
Oh, yes. After we test negative for COVID, yes.
All right,
For
my
sure.
love.
Thank
Thank
you,
you
Barbara.
again.
Thank you. Thanks, Barbara. Take care.
Bye.